Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This week, the Labour Party saw its largest ever business turnout as Britain's corporate leaders gathered to bend the ear of the government. We, of course, were there covering it for the Bloomberg UK Politics podcast. So, for a special episode, here is the Business and Trade Secretary Jonathan Reynolds in conversation with our UK correspondent Lizzy Burden. They were at the political think tank Labour Together's tent at the Labour Party conference earlier this week.
Johnny, you've had a fantastic turnout from business yet again this year. Serious question, what are you putting in the smoked salmon and scrambled eggs?
Well, first of all, it's lovely to see people here. If you're going to do one of these events, it's always a bit embarrassing. You haven't got an audience, so it's nice to see the room full. But, I mean, look, I have always believed that a Labour Party committed to what I believe is the historic mainstream agenda of the Labour Party as a party of working people is in the modern age actually not just a good partner for business, it's a better one than the Conservative Party is, right? And I think if you genuinely believe that, if you have a case for that, to be able to be on stage yesterday saying we campaigned before the election as a pro-business party, we're going to govern as a pro-business party, this is our agenda, I think it's got something there for everybody, and you get a great response from conference floor for that. That is great. I think it reflects the reality. When I look at some of our political opponents, they're much more unpredictable. There's far less stability from them. And I think both in terms of the ambition of the government, but also the improvement in the overall business environment that we have brought in by that stability and will then introduce to our legislative and economic agenda. At the heart of it, there's a product, there's a substance there, as well as the fact I'm told I can be charming.
Yeah, but look, I feel like there's no doubt in the vibes are good, right? What we want is detail. And I was speaking to an economist at one of the main business lobby groups yesterday. They were saying the reason that these stories about infighting at number 10 and freebies are sparking up is because you have kind of left a vacuum on detail. Do you get that business is frustrated about the lack of detail?
No, it feels like the government's been in power for several years, but it is, 2 months, and August is a big chunk of that. Before you have a budget, you always have, a lot of speculation as to what is in it. And when you've got such a dire fiscal inheritance as the new government, people look at it and say, well, I'm worried because, this is clearly a difficult situation for any government. What will that mean? And then you get into a situation for a couple of weeks, as we have now, where journalists just kind of ask you anything and you say you've got to wait till the budget, and then that becomes a story in itself. So look, I think, of course, we understand that framework. But I would again say to people, don't just look at what I said yesterday, what Rachel said. Look at the absolute overall objective of the government, right? And on this, we are absolutely right. Unless the UK improves its business environment, its business investment, its productivity, and its economic growth, there will not be any spending review at any time. That is not challenging in a country which is getting older and which has left its major trading partner on its block. The overall success of this government depends on addressing those issues. And if I was in business looking at the government, I would take some heart from that.
But I know that Rachel Reeves has been talking about this £22 billion black hole in the public finances and how she's going to fix it. Do you accept that there are lots of business leaders here worried about tax rises in the budget?
Well, whenever you've got such a dire inheritance and then a government committed to fixing and governing for the long term, of course they're going to look at that. But again, I say be reassured by the agenda that we have, the importance that we have, the way, so many of those policies have been designed, co-produced alongside business. And when you're looking at where the priorities of the government are, they could not be clearer.
Yeah. 5 weeks of uncertainty seems a long time when we've already seen that hit to consumer confidence in GfK's latest numbers. If we're going to go big picture then, I was on the way out of Rachel Reeves' speech yesterday and I bumped into a Labour minister. I said to her, is it going to be 5 years of prudence and then 5 years of prosperity? And she looked at me and she said, it's a decade of national renewal. Work it out for yourself. That's a pretty bleak message for business, isn't it?
No, look, it's the point of having to make tough decisions. What we've got to get across this conference is, that's not just about you've got a problem, you're going to fix it. That is about how you get to the better times, right? Anyone who has lived in the UK in recent history knows what happens when a government isn't committed to being responsible with the public finances. They know the burdens that will come from that. So I think what we've got to do is say where there are tough decisions that have had to be made, it isn't just about addressing that short-term problem or a medium-term problem. That's what gets you to a better future. That's the stability upon which you build the good things. And I'm getting teased a little bit by some colleagues because their sort of standout quote on the House magazine interview I've done is, you've got to have discipline to have nice things, which sounds a little bit...
Is that what you tell your children?
Yeah, exactly. It could be misconstrued. But the point of that is, you shouldn't posit it as a contrast between being disciplined and wanting that better future. The two things have to go together. Okay,
one of the few bits of new detail we got from the Chancellor in her speech yesterday was that you're going to announce your industrial strategy next month. So you're among friends here, Johnny. Let's make some news. What can we expect?
Well, tempting as it is at this point in the week, where, let's be honest, you've done your speech on podium, your voice is going a little bit.
Oh, excuse me.
You're in this thing. It's something like, if you send you off to sleep in a nice cozy tent like this, you could
turn it up.
You could reveal too much. But I mean, look, I think people know, first of all, the industrial strategy is a key component, but it is one component of the wider economic strategy. It sits for me in my department. I think of it as four main priorities. You have the industrial strategy, the plan for small business, the Make Work Pay package, and then the trade policy and FTA negotiations. So it's a key part of that. It is a recognition that if we want to see a meaningful improvement in the UK's economic performance, certain sectors contribute more than others to that. I mean, look at the history of the UK since 1990. I mean, about half of our GDP growth has come from advanced manufacturing, ICT, and financial and professional services. So you've got to have that. It doesn't mean they're the only sectors that you love. I've got to stress that very carefully. But we have got to compete. I mean, I'm sick, to be honest, of people telling me how good the French offer is, and they've met with Macron and the offer is more compelling than the UK. We've got to recognise we've got to compete with that. And I don't think there's any secret as to what the components of that should be. You need in the jargon, a set of horizontal policy levers, things like energy prices, skills that are attractive to businesses across the board. You need some sector strategies in there, making sure you're getting the best of the economic opportunities from the growth of those sectors. The two things I think I've got to recognise, and I'm always pretty candid on, is obviously this is different to the last government. People are going to ask, well, what's different to the last time it was tried? The Greg Clark era, which I thought was quite a credible attempt. I mean, the first thing is longevity. The whole point is to be there for the long term, and UK's had a few strategies that have not made it past the month's benchmark. But also it's got to be cross-government. And I think the sense of the last time it being just a Department of Business and Trade priority, not of the whole Cabinet. And I can tell you my colleagues are on board, excited. I've done the presentation to the Cabinet around the collective agreement around that. They've got, I think, a way to contribute in every department to the growth mission as part of that. And I'm genuinely excited to have, I think, for the first time, a set of relationships across government that I think make it possible to do what the UK has always needed in this area.
Well, you talk about the way that different departments are going to work together. When I think about the tech sector specifically, and you mentioned it, I think about the proposals to scrap an £800 million supercomputer and drop a £500 million artificial intelligence plan. And those proposals were triggered by the Chancellor, the Treasury, telling departments to find £3 billion of savings per year. How is that firing up the economy?
Well, look, I know on those two specific issues, Peter is, with the Treasury, actively engaged in what the outcome of those reviews will be, and they are important. I mean, I think, it comes back to, if you think about the government's fiscal rules, in my view, insufficient attention or not enough recognition has been given to the fact that the first of those fiscal rules, so the balancing of day-to-day spending with taxation, separating out capital investment, give us a chance to stop doing what the last government did too much of, which is, filling up your day-to-day spending by raiding your capital budget, so you're not getting that long-term investment. So this is a government that is committed to a much greater degree to that long-term investment. I mean, you will know an event like this, at a conference like this, everyone comes and tells you, their investment priority will actually save the country money in the long term, and you can't do everything. But that long-term framework is absolutely what Rachel and this government is about.
And can you tell us more about how you're going to pick which sectors get this active support, what the metrics are?
Yeah, look, I mean, it is got to be driven by some very hard empirical data as to where the opportunities are, where we are able to position the UK to get a much greater share of the big global investment cycles that are available. I know, and there'll be a lot of people here who work for trade organisations or whatever, and if I was working for one of those, I would want to get my sector into that. I'm going to have to be clear with people, it can't be everything. It's not a strategy if you don't pick. Let's be frank about that. But again, it doesn't mean the government has no interest or no love or not a policy package for the rest of the economy. There's a whole set of other policies in place around that. But the test is building on the things that we know we're good at, some real competitive strengths. Where do we need to focus to recognise the international competition that we're facing is very strong. And I think, maybe some things we've never seen before. I basically spend my time looking around the world at what's worth nicking. And there's some pretty interesting stuff. I think, people would be aware of just how long it can take to get an major investment project complete in the UK. It is measured at times in decades. That's not great. I think how you prepare sites, land, work across government on things like grid connections, planning policy, to make sure you've got the sites that some of those inward investments could come into is a really interesting thing. The French have a version of this again. So.
Well, when you look at the French and you think about beating them, would it not help us if you just got on and picked an investment minister?
Well, look, people know we had an investment minister. There were some unforeseen complications around that, if you think about the qualifications you need for this role, you need a significant level of experience. You'll almost certainly have some existing business engagements that you'll need to exit from, and that is what happened around that. But I have no doubt we'll get an extremely high-quality investment minister, and if you want the right person, that's what's the most important thing in that choice. It's not about acting quickly when your original plans had to be changed.
There was another interesting line in the Chancellor's speech yesterday. She said, I just want to quote, "It is time that the Treasury moved on from just counting the costs of investments to recognising the benefits too." What does that mean in practice?
I love that line. Yeah, that
let's
was
unpack.
Great. I mean, look, there is a perception, and my experience of government is measured in months, so I can't really judge it. That the sense of the Treasury holding back some of the longer. Well, yeah, exactly. Because the Treasury is obviously, people will know, in most countries would be two separate ministries in the main, so a very significant role. And look, I respect the fact that I often say, I'm an audience like this, I get pitched some great ideas, and I also get pitched some ones that aren't that great. There's got to be a bit of government that is there to really test a proposition, and I understand that. But I think, historically, again, seen as some historic Whitehall tensions between the different versions of the business department and the Treasury, in the sense that we want to get past that. We want to work together. I mean, I think if you saw both speeches yesterday from myself and then Rachel's, you will see an absolute alignment and consistency of what we are saying, not just on economic policy, but on workers' rights, on the investment challenge, and what we're trying to do. And I think, that explicit commitment from Rachel when she gave her first address to Treasury civil servants saying, I want you to be part of and help delivering the industrial strategy of this government, I think that is very, very good. And it's a recognition of the key institutional force that has to be deployed of the Treasury behind the growth mission.
I want to come back to this idea that you're all singing from the same hymn sheet, but let me just ask you whether she's going to move the National Wealth Fund and GB Energy off the government's books so that the private debt they raise doesn't count towards the borrowing, so that she can actually get a bit more headroom. I think actually your pals in France do that.
Well, there are different models across Europe, but if you think I'm going to answer that, you know me far too well to get into the Chancellor's domain in that regard. But
turn up the heat.
Look, the National Wealth Fund is obviously about, the UK has a lot of public finance institutions, and they do different things. Those roles have got to be respected, but the better alignment of them around the government's objectives is the priority.
You've talked about being sick of losing out to France and Spain. We've heard from Singapore's sovereign wealth fund saying that UK utilities are uninvestable because the regulators are too unpredictable. When we think about the Thames water crisis and how that could, excuse the pun, spill over into housing and other areas that are crucial to your growth mission, I do wonder whether it's time for the government to intervene with Ofwat and let the companies raise bills so that they can get the investment in the infrastructure that they need?
Well, look, I would accept the criticism of the lack of predictability in a whole range of UK public policy over the last decade. You know, I think there are reasonable complaints to be had, and I don't just mean changes of Prime Minister, but, you know, some fundamental changes of policy that will frustrate people and lead to uncertainty. I mean, I would say on the water sector, and obviously Steve and the DEFRA team lead on it, but I mean, you did have an era of fairly astonishing returns for investors. I mean, for a regulated, you know, series of regulated regional monopolies to be making double-digit investment returns.
And yet investors have short memory. Exactly,
you know, and so the greater, you know, demands in terms of those financial structures, and, you know, by the way, to have a whole investment strategy, if that was entirely predicated on historically low interest rates, I mean, you know, you've got to ask people, what were you doing there? What skills were you bringing to that investment? And I think there is, you know, we've got to recognise some of the investors in those companies there today are not the ones who were there in that era. But look, you know, it's what's reasonable for investors in terms of recognising that's a sector that needs a huge amount of investment. But I would also say as well to any investor, you know, something like a regulated water industry of regional monopolies that people have to buy, you know, public consent's important. If you think you can have a stable investment environment where people are seeing, you know, targets not hit, the service not being good, money going out not because it's being run in a good way, but because the financial engineering of that, that's not a good investment environment either. So look, Steve and the DEFRA team are working very closely with the water companies around that. And excuse me, I always say, you've got to think and take the public with you on these questions as well.
I mean, I spoke to Steve myself on Sunday. I mean, is it really wise to take this hands-off approach to the regulator when, as I say, it's such a crucial industry to the bigger growth picture?
I wouldn't, unless Steve said it himself, characterise that as a hands-off approach from the DEFRA team in terms of how they are doing it. You know, it's clearly a sector with a lot of challenges, has a bigger readout for me in terms of the investability of Britain and, you know, some of those issues that you are referring to, but I am kept very closely up to date with that department's engagement, and I wouldn't characterise it as hands-off at all.
While we're thinking about investment from abroad, the Foreign Secretary's taken this kind of legalistic approach to the war in Gaza, to arms sales to Israel. I wonder if you think that that's going to make a headache for you down the line when it comes to taking investment from the Gulf?
Well, first of all, I don't think that's an entirely fair characterisation of David in the Middle East, response that we've had to make. I mean, what we have done is be true and faithful to the existing laws of the United Kingdom, which, when we talk about our export licensing regime around defence and dual-use products, you know, there's a very clear legal test in place. He has received legal advice. That has changed. You know, part of the assessment of that is in the information that you receive from the whole diplomatic footprint of the United Kingdom. Once that decision is made, which in this case was the possibility, the clear risk of Israel being in contravention of international humanitarian law, I then decide the scope of the government's decision in order to do that. But he hasn't taken any different approach to that. Those are the laws of the United Kingdom.
You could argue that it's a political decision to take the legal advice and make the decision in the end.
I would really push strongly back on that. It's not a political decision to take legal advice. That's how the system works. You get a review every couple of months in terms of, is that compliance taking place? And once that decision comes back, and in this case it was the risk around treatment of detainees and access to humanitarian aid in Gaza, the decision was made, and then the scope of that, as I say, is me. But that is the existing, you know, the system hasn't changed from one government to the next.
But the point is, it sets up a precedent where perhaps when it comes to taking investment, for example, from Saudi Arabia, you need to perhaps give higher status to the human rights record. Does it make it harder to take money from Riyadh? I know you were there last week.
No, I think there are different things. So obviously we have and have always made clear the UK has a particularly stringent and widely recognised, you know, export licensing regime. When it comes to investment from other parts of the world, you know, we made clear in the manifesto we do want to deal with the GCC. We do want to deal with India. I'm hoping my voice is not going to fail halfway through this and it looks like I'm avoiding your questions. But look, the case we will make there is We accept those are not countries in the sense of, say, the Gulf that are Western democracies. They've got different political systems to ourselves. We are not going to say, however, that those relationships are just commercial. We think British engagement in those places is important. We think that there's a benefit that is greater than the economic impact of British businesses being in those places. But we're not going to pretend that they, will address some of those issues in the trade agreements that we have, but we're going to recognise that difference. And the point being that we've got to accept the world as it is if we want to make it a better place.
So you'd rather be in the tent, as it were. But I mean, this is a country whose crown prince, US intelligence agencies say murdered Jamal Khashoggi, and that was only 6 years ago. What's changed so much since then to change your attitude? Well,
look, first of all, there is a huge amount of UK business activity with the Gulf and with Saudi Arabia, so that's already there. Do we believe that British engagement in the Gulf with Saudi is a good thing? Do we believe the direction of travel of, in this case, specifically Saudi Arabia, is one that, I'm not saying there are not major issues, but is the direction of travel in Saudi, which is probably a country I would say has changed more than any other in the last 10 years, towards the kind of things that we've seen happen in Saudi in recent years, particularly around the rights of women and role of women in the labour market. Do we think that's a good thing? Yes. It's still very much imperfect. But I would say our engagement helps with a process that is heading in a positive direction. I think fundamentally, trying to maintain dialogue and engagement between the West and the Gulf is a good thing.
I also want to talk about the transition to net zero. How are you going to make sure that decarbonisation doesn't equal deindustrialisation? What about all the jobs in oil and gas?
Well, look, that is the absolute essential focus of meeting the carbon budgets of the next few years. It's, again, something shared across all of the cabinet. Now, the kind of things you need to do that cover everything from industrial energy prices to the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, how the ETS functions. Is it producing an investable business case for decarbonising in the UK, or is it frankly adding costs that then mean you're outsourcing those emissions? Obviously, the potential around the carbon capture clusters is a key part of that as well. I think we've got to recognise, and we've talked about this in the Net Zero and Clean Energy Mission Board, the metrics of how we measure that success are clearly important. So at the minute, quite frankly, when we've got something like a major deindustrialisation, because a major part of our industrial capacity is going abroad, that obviously appears as a positive, if you like, in terms of how we measure that, even though if our emissions footprint might be going up in terms of consumption terms. So there's, in my view, the need for a really quite comprehensive change in how we measure, but also in that wider policy environment to make sure that isn't the case. And I would say, for the continued public consent for the energy transition, this is the most important thing.
Well, how big a role will Skills England play in that transition from oil and gas to green jobs?
Skills England is a major initiative. You might hear a little bit about it later today, but I think we would all recognise there is in the UK, first of all, a huge skills challenge, and then second of all, the need to make sure what our manifesto commitment on the apprenticeship levy, again, a new policy worked on with business, more flexibilities there to free up that resource, works very closely with the devolution agenda around the capacity of FE and so forth to work around that. But, the lack of connection, I would say, between the immigration system, the skills system, has been a major feature. And so I think the creation of Skills England is crucial. What we will always need more than anything else to attract investment to the UK is the right skilled workforce. That's what people are looking for first and foremost.
I said I wanted to come back to these perceived rifts in government. While we're talking about jobs, we're told that the Workers' Rights Bill is going to be ready in 20 days. Is that still the expectation?
Yeah, 100 days.
Okay. Well, businesses are telling me that they're annoyed. It seems that there is a rift between you and the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, that you've not been singing from the same hymn sheet when it comes to probation periods. Do you get that frustration?
No, genuinely not. That story is not true. I would, swear on anything you want. That story is not true. We've worked extremely closely together, the Deputy Prime Minister and I. We're obviously, with neighbouring MPs, we're quite close friends as well. Work very closely with the Treasury, work very closely with the relevant ministries where that comes in to be part of the package. The key part of this has always been our commitment to probation periods around rights to day one, recognising that where sometimes you take people on, you need a different process if it's not working out initially in terms of continuing that employment relationship. That's the number one thing businesses asked for. We'd already committed to that before the election. The detail of how we implement that is obviously part of the bill and the consultation, but I think it will deliver the right balance between greater security for working people and the flexibility business needs.
I mean, should we interpret it that you are steering Angela Rayner's baby through Parliament because you're there to stand up for business, she's going to stand up for the unions, and somewhere in between we'll get a healthy balance between the two?
No. I mean, this is a pro-worker, pro-business government. And I said to my civil servants in the first week, that doesn't mean, we do a bit of workers' rights and then we do a bit of planning liberalisation and we do a bit of Skills England. It's a recognition that what every working person in this country needs is a stronger economy. That requires greater business investment. That's in all our interests, not just business interest. It's also a recognition that we need, reforms to the labour market to give people a little bit more security, to make sure we're focusing on the productivity challenge by being able to invest in their workforce. Also recognising, by the way, that a lot of businesses already do things way and beyond what we will raise the floor to. And that is an agenda which Angela totally is behind, I am totally behind, Rachel is totally behind. And of course, this is a complex piece of legislation that we're delivering in 100 days, a great achievement by my team, my officials, I think, behind that. And so we've had to make decisions at pace. It's why we began the engagement on the bill with business and with unions, not after we publish it, but immediately from day one. And again, I think it's something the whole government is behind, and I think, I'm looking forward to being able to present it.
But surely if the top aim of the government is growth, business is always going to win over the unions.
It's growth in a way that every person benefits from and every bit of the country feels. So perhaps the old sense that one bit of the country can do well and then you just redistribute it to the rest, the kind of Portugal with Singapore at the bottom analogy. No, that's not good enough. Everyone, if you've got a stronger economy and you've made the business environment better, you've removed some of the barriers to that, and people have still got a situation in some cases where they genuinely don't know how many hours they're working next week, even though they would like to. They're not going to care what the business investment and productivity and growth figures are. And I think people have got to understand that whole package. I think business respects our mandate, respects what we're trying to do, and recognises how proportionate and fair and engaged we are in determining to deliver that agenda.
But there is a clash between business and unions on this. The CBI says 58% of businesses think there's going to be a negative impact from overhauling flexibility rules. We have some businesses wanting to use GPS tracking and click monitoring. The unions want a say on that. We hear that you're not going to give them that say, even though you promised to give it to them before the election. Is that right?
We've got to see the bill when it is presented. It's always been the case that this bill would not deliver the whole package. We'll have a roadmap alongside it for some other elements. I mean, on things like worker status, that's a very complex area with a lot of action in the courts, and I think Parliament does need to give a steer to those. But look, I wouldn't present it in that entirely binary way. Of course, there'll be tensions in part of the programme, but can we, as a country, look to a future where we're using technology in a way that better addresses some of those productivity challenges, that need for business investment, in a way which is being seen to be done in partnership with working people because they're going to get the benefits of that stronger economy, rather than being done to them. That's the challenge. The way the labour market has changed, the way that technology has changed, the way we work, is massive. And I don't necessarily think it has to be something where some people feel they're losing and some people feel they're winning. I think you can do that in a way which brings people with you.
Well, I mean, on the flip side, that was the business perspective. I speak to equality campaigners who say that what you're doing just gives people what they already have and it's not going to make much of a difference. What do you say to them?
In what regard?
Well, they already can work from home, for example. So what do you need to step in to do for them? Well,
obviously we have had flexible working in the UK for 20 years. I think it's a bit of a shock sometimes when I read, some of the newspaper coverage of the plan to make work pay, and you think we're about to invent flexible working when most people are pretty familiar with it. But it's really about what is the process by which you are able to request that? What is the guidance to business in terms of what is a legitimate reason to say you can't do that? And I've been absolutely clear, there are times when there'll be very clear business needs to not be able to do that. I mean, as a trainee solicitor, when I was doing that in my life, you needed people to learn from in the workplace. That's absolutely fair. But do we recognise the benefits that come from that? And the evidence around, flexibility when it works for employer and employee are pretty overwhelming in terms of resilience, productivity, longevity in an occupation. all those benefits there, and do we want to change the process, give that perhaps to a bigger group of people by making the process more transparent, more straightforward? Well, I think that is a substantial difference. And look, Lizzy, I mean, on all of this, we either get stories which are like, this is going to radically change the world and, the economy will collapse, or it's going to make no impact whatsoever. I mean, pretty confident in saying it's neither of those things, right? It's a series of measures that will make a positive difference to people's lives. I think bring the labour market framework in the UK up to date. I think deliver some things that are real tangible benefits to working people in a way which is not too onerous to business.
Well, it's interesting, on work from home, you say that there's no rifts in the government, but you've been saying that it makes you more motivated and resilient to have the option to work from home. The Chancellor's been saying that she goes into the Treasury every day because she wants to set an example and everyone follow her. I was speaking to Darren Jones, he says, well, that's my boss, I'll be going in as well. That seems like a difference between the two of you. Are you saying that she's bizarre like Jacob Rees-Mogg?
No, I would never compare Rachel to Jacob Rees-Mogg, both on the merits of that and the fact that, I think that she wouldn't find that favourable. Look, when Jacob Rees-Mogg was business secretary, this is the point I was making. Think of all the amazing things the Department of Business and Trade does. Look at the amazing skills we've got, the amazing teams of people, not just in the UK, but around the world. 8,000 people work for the department. A brief covering economic security, regulation, industrial policy, small business, international trade. And his number one priority was walking around the old Admiralty, putting post-it notes on, wherever the building was at the time, putting post-it notes on civil service desks. I do think that's an odd priority, right? I think there's a lot of better stuff you'd want the business secretary of this country focused on. But the bit where Rachel and I are completely aligned is like, it's a business decision, right? There are times when there'll be a business need to say we want people into the office, and there are times when that isn't necessary. And it's not about dictating to business, but having in place what we've already got, which is a recognition. We can put things in place to everyone's benefit, and we're going to make in the bill that process more straightforward. I think make it available to a bigger group of people. But there will always be, and we'll always want, businesses fundamentally making their decisions about that. But I think the changes we can make in the bill will make a positive contribution to making that available to a bigger group of people.
So where Amazon's bringing people back to the office 5 days a week, are they wrong?
Actually, if you look at the press coverage of Amazon, then you look at what they already have in place in terms of the flexibilities you can request within that. It's not quite as binary as the initial story took place. But look, I would say again, as the point of view of someone who now has a great many people working from them, for the Department of Business and Trade, I want the talent pool available to me for people I can employ to be the entire United Kingdom and people abroad. I don't just want that to be traditional Whitehall concept of London and the South East. I've got offices all around the UK. I've got flexibilities in place to make sure if you are a parent or you've got caring responsibilities, you can continue to be part of the team or you could come into the team. And I think that's good practice. I think that gives me an edge. I think it's also important for a government department generally to really have people working for it in this brief who live and understand all parts of the United Kingdom. And so, look, I see the business need for that. I'm not dictating to any other business. And I think sometimes some of the headlines around this, again, presented in a very binary way, you look at the actual practice in those places and it's quite different.
Just before we take some audience questions, because I know I'm hogging proceedings, I just want to relate this to the economic inactivity problem. Do you see boosting workers' rights as a way to get people back to work and tackle that?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting point. So I think we would all recognise the huge growth of out-of-work economic inactivity after the pandemic. I mean, 10% higher cost to the country a year, about 16 billion pounds. I mean, this is a major issue, and the state of the labour market is obviously a major concern. I don't think it's the only answer, but I think work that is in some ways structured in a more flexible way should make some of those jobs available to a wider group of people. I think, again, it shouldn't be a punitive thing, but if we can create a situation where there's more on offer in terms of how we might be able to get people into those jobs, and at the same time have an employment framework that we're going to put in place that recognises why probationary periods will be quite important in that. You're going to take a bit of a risk on someone. You're going to want to know if it doesn't work out, it's okay, and there's a way that can be dealt with. I think it could make an important contribution to that. I wouldn't oversell it, but I think it's an important part.
But so should companies do more to stop people getting sick in the first place?
Yes, and I mean, look, an incredible number of people on NHS waiting lists. You break that down by region, I mean, it's extraordinary for some parts of the country. So there's an obvious priority there that people need healthcare, they're going to need to get it in order to come back to to the workplace. But look, this is going to have to be a major focus of government, some of its health, some of its reform of the Department of Work and Pensions and how employment support is delivered. But of course, I would say none of that will really have the impact we want unless businesses are willing to take people on and employ them, and I'll make sure that's possible under what we're putting forward.
Okay, well that's enough from me. Have we got any questions? Let's start near where you are, Belle. There's a lady behind you.
Hello, thank you. I'm Kay Polly from the Finance Innovation Lab. We know that lack of access to capital is something that holds back a lot of businesses, particularly small businesses. And I really like what you said about nicking ideas from other countries, because we know in the US there's a Community Reinvestment Act in place already there that means that mainstream banks have to work in partnership with purpose-driven lenders like CDFIs that are much, much more likely to lend to startups and to small businesses who are growing. So do you think that is something that we should look at here in the UK? As I think you might know, there's a coalition of around 30 organisations calling for that to happen through a Fair Banking Act.
Brilliant. Come on. Yeah, thank you, Kate. I literally do scour the world trying to steal ideas that are good, and I've always been interested in what they have in the US. I think actually the role of CDFIs in the UK is underappreciated. I went to a business in my constituency recently that had been supported in that way. I think it's a bigger story we could tell maybe. Some people aren't always aware of it, and the work you're doing is really important in that. I don't think for historical reasons and the sort of structure of the financial system, you can directly take the Community Investment Act from the US here, but the point about how you support that diversity of business support in terms of lending is really, really important. We've also got some reforms to the British Business Bank that we're working on in terms of, again, taking ideas, in this case, again, from France, about how you can blend maybe some public and private money to create specific funds targeted at some of the problems and market failures that we see. But I mean, we've been talking about this for a long period of time in many jobs that I've had. The banks will always say, there's more an offer than the demand for it, and small business will always say there's not enough, and sometimes that is about the risk profile. I think the answer to addressing that is the kind of diversified structures you're talking about.
Another lady in the front here.
Juliet Samuel from The Times. Under the last government, post-COVID or just after the start of COVID, there was this work kicked off to do supply chain mapping to locate vulnerabilities in, the stuff we import. They produced, one or two bits of work and then seemed to get folded into other departments. Is that something that's a priority for you, given the way the world is headed? And will you be producing something comprehensive on it? And you mentioned that you think dialogue and engagement is the way forward with the Gulf. Would you apply that to China as well? Could we see a shift in policy towards China?
Brilliant. Thanks, Juliet. So just two enormous questions there about supply chain vulnerabilities and China. Yes, I was interested very much in the work that was announced by the previous government. I've asked to have a look at where they had got to with some of that. I don't think it was particularly developed, to be honest, but I think recognising that some of the supply chain vulnerabilities we have, and we've seen very much exposed around the pandemic, and then the invasion of Ukraine, make this something government has got to be interested in. I've no announcements for you in that space yet. But in relation to China, you'll know the government is committed to a China audit that covers a whole range of relationships. I do think, as David Lammy himself has said, that part of the agenda will be having to confront China. Some of it is cooperation. He has a third one as well, which I can't quite remember. But, there are some really important economic relationships with China. It's our sixth biggest trading partner. So anyone seeking to decouple the West or the UK from that clearly would be very significant. But also, let's be frank, the world today, under this Labour government, just look how different it is to the last Labour government. I was always, I'd say, someone of the view that the world, as it had that greater level of economic integration, it reduced some of those big strategic risks. And that hasn't happened in the way any of us would have planned or wanted. It hasn't stopped, obviously, a war in Europe. It hasn't stopped an increasing level of tension between China and the US. So look, some of this will be what is the emerging position amongst our friends and allies, and we obviously have a significant presidential election in the US, which will shape some of their policy response to this. But the China order will cover all of this. But where under that kind of policy that David has set forward towards China, where there could be cooperation, a lot of that is more, I think, in the trade space. So there are opportunities around that, but we've got to continue to develop this in collaboration with our friends and partners, because any response which differed from that would have to be very much an integrated Western world response.
I'm going to take pity on the cheap seats at the back. There's a man standing.
Thank you very much. And on that note, apologies, I missed the first half an hour, so if I ask something that's been covered, I apologise. So there was a lot of talk pre-election about the concept of securonomics, and obviously we talked about supply chains briefly there. That talk seems to have died down a little bit post-election. Also, we have the National Security and Investment Act regime, and obviously you've spoken publicly about the Royal Mail case, for example. Yeah. Will Labour be looking to use the NSIA regime to advance that kind of securonomics agenda, or will it try and stay as apolitical as possible?
Yeah, we covered all this before you came in. I mean, look, the National Security Investment Act is an important piece of legislation already. You know, the new government has a number of cases where it is actively engaged around that. You know, the work around securonomics and some of the work that Rachel and the wider cabinet team did on that, it is important. It references, essentially what Juliet was asking about there in terms of how the world has changed. What do we need from government? The sense of, the agenda around the 1990s of the time, it being so different, it does reflect that. And it's, some of that, let's be clear, business themselves are diversifying supply chains in response to some of those global risks. But I do think the role of government is to use the capacity and resources of government to work with businesses around some of those risks, to manage some of that. The wider securonomics agenda also kind of covers things like the plan to make work pay in terms of working people's security within that system. But I'd also say on this, I think sometimes people, when they compare the UK to, say, the US, the UK is a much more globally exposed trading nation. There are things that are sometimes put forward, say, in the US political system, which if we were to follow in exactly the same way, the relative degree of difficulty and pain for business in the UK would be greater because of those relationships, and particularly around things like our financial system. So whilst wanting to work with friends and allies, you've got to, as a UK government, always recognise exactly what that would mean for the UK. But that whole agenda still remains something of relevance and interest to the whole of the government, because that is the world in which we live now.
There's a gentleman in the second row.
Hi, I'm Simon Fraser from Flint Global. I wonder if you could give us an indication of your ambitions for the October Investment Summit, what you're hoping to get out of it, and a particular question, would it not have been more sensible to have that summit after the budget rather than before the budget in terms of the environment in which investors knew what they were operating in?
And is it true that half the people you've invited haven't yet confirmed they're coming?
No. I mean, look, the problem with the Investment Summit is it's like planning a wedding and everybody wants to come, right? And what you want is the top, caliber of people with, the ability to deploy substantial amounts of investment in the UK, and making sure you manage that to get the caliber you want is really, really important around it. I mean, look, what the Investment Summit is about showcasing to an international investor audience the approach of the new government and the things that we can bring that we haven't seen in the UK before, and the things which we feel are a genuine advantage to the UK compared to other countries. So let's take that incredible transformation in the UK's relative position in terms of economic stability and political stability. That's an important thing. It's actually the major thing that businesses want. Let's talk about the government's ambition around the industrial strategy to shape markets, to get the most of those investment opportunities for the UK. I mean, many investors told me in the last government, we just kind of don't really understand what the UK is pitching itself as after Brexit. What's your elevator pitch? What's your short pitch as to why we should come to you? I think making clear we are an internationalist party, that we can improve that relationship with the EU, and we're still seeking these trade opportunities around the world, is a big part of that. And then I think, look, to be, a party of the centre-left, committed and politically committed to actively removing barriers to investment and business activity on things like planning, on saying we're going to build homes, we are going to change the system. I think that is quite distinctive. I really do. And I think the chance to put that to an international audience is a key part of what we wanted on timing. We wanted it in 100 days, and that's why it's taking place when it is.
Another one on the front row here.
Thank you very much. Stefan Boscher from Politico. What would you say to the businesses who are concerned about the extent of some of the reforms you are looking to do when it comes to union access to workplaces? I've heard some concerns about they might go too far. And then just secondly, on the back of that, do you think that unions should be in every workplace in this country?
Thanks, Stefan. I mean, look, again, I don't think there's anything anyone will be worried about as part of that package. I think there are many successful businesses in the UK that are familiar to dealing with unions, that there are advantages of having that collective employee voice in the workplace. We obviously are the Labour Party. We think that is a good thing. I think if you look at some of the strongest sectors of the UK economy, they're sectors with significant union representation. I mean, I said yesterday in my speech, and I mean it. I mean, the fact is, most of the unions at this conference have fought harder for British industry in key sectors than the Conservative Party has over the last decade. So I think we've got to recognise what they bring to the table. And for me, the right to be represented in the workplace is a kind of fundamental human right, And, that's equally the case if people don't want that representation. But I think, anyone, no matter what their politics, would recognise that's a legitimate part of representation for the workforce in any employee situation.
There's a lady in blue at the back. I'm just making you walk really far.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
A tennis match, Belle.
Thank you. Sam Smethers, Surviving Economic Abuse. The government set itself a goal of halving violence against women and girls in 10 years. And the only way that's going to be achieved is every government department works together. And at C, we work with UK Finance, we work with financial services firms. We have the support of Starling Bank, which we're very grateful for, to highlight good practice and really ensure they can prevent and disrupt economic abuse. So what will you and your department be doing to ensure the government delivers that target?
Yeah, well, it's one of the missions we're not always the most directly associated with, but of course an important one for the whole of the government. I mean, I think there is first of all on the crime mission a overwhelming need to recognise that the burdens put on businesses by crimes against them, and that's already, particularly in the retail space around shoplifting, that's already been a priority. But look, when it comes to any specific part of that, such as the pledge for violence against women and girls, I don't think we have some of the most direct levers in that, but it is something the whole government is committed to. I think the missions are really helpful because they give you the key organising principles of government. So maybe it's about when you're asked to make a decision and you're considering that as a priority in terms of that. But I stand ready on a whole range of areas to give the support from the department that is necessary to do that.
I'm going to take the privilege and ask Lucy White from Bloomberg News.
Thanks. Lizzy's already introduced me, so we'll go with that.
Imagine you gave a different name and you'd got the wrong person.
I was going to ask around, you were talking about making sure different departments are all cooperating with each other. I mean, we've heard about previous governments in the past wanting to break down silos, and nothing's seemingly ever really happened around that. Presumably you've got civil servants who are very set in their ways and don't necessarily have the best connections with other departments. How are you going to bring the civil servants along with you in this journey?
I mean, I think that's a little unfair on some of the civil servants. I mean, for instance, so many of the people who work for me in DBT have themselves worked for the Treasury. There is that kind of experience of people will tell me how they think, for instance, a Treasury official might approach something because they themselves have been within that department. But look, I think most of all, I always sort of deferentially recognise. I've seen a lot of governments say we're going to, cross-government working, it's all going to be a priority. I mean, I can only observe from outside the governments I have shadowed, and I'd say, the first problem they had is, most of the chancellors and business secretaries I've seen didn't really like each other. I mean, that's not going to get to a good situation. At times they've been political opponents, or clearly, there's been tensions within there, or with Downing Street. I think we have in the personnel in the cabinet some really important personal relationships that underpin it, with people who have turned around the Labour Party from a pretty desperate position to want to go into government, and there's a kind of unity and strength of the team that comes from that. But look, the agenda is very much shared from all bits of government, and I feel already, if you give the civil service, not just clear policy direction, but why you're doing it, what you're seeking to achieve, how you work with other places. Of course, different departments kind of fight their corner on what we call the right-arounds, where, a policy comes, but that is kind of broadly how the system works. I mean, when I get something from another team, I'm interested in the impact on business. it could be a great policy, but what's the regulatory burden? Is that reasonable? Is it fair? Is it proportionate? Who do I know from a crowd like this I'm going to need to speak to get that right? So, I mean, I'm not criticising other people because I defend that bit of government myself. But I do think where we've had very clear political steers, very clear, relationships from, I'm getting used to all the jargon, but bilaterals when you have a meeting with a cabinet colleague or a quad when it's full. If you give the civil service that direction, so far they've responded magnificently, whether that's the preparation of the Employment Rights Bill, the Investment Summit. We've got four bills in the King's Speech. I mean, it's a lot of work for a department at once, but they're in my view, they're a privilege and a pleasure to work with because they can respond to that clear sense of political direction in a way which I think is really exciting.
There's a lady in the aisle there next to you.
Hi, Jonathan Cannon from the University of York, and specifically in this context, Bio Yorkshire, which is aiming to accelerate the growth of the bioeconomy. I'm on the spirit of how closely you're working with Treasury and that shared agenda. How much can you influence the opportunity of second-tier cities to have the advantage of investment zones that are not based on current Treasury methodologies, that are really about population density, and therefore we fall between the cracks? Because there's a huge opportunity, but I think the methodologies currently employed are not particularly advantageous for that size and scale of city.
Sure. I think that's a very skillful, actually specific request of me to Rachel rather than a question around that, but very well done. Yeah. Look, again, as we talked about it at a previous Fringe, this is a government that recognises and is proud of the UK's strengths in higher education, recognises the economic contribution that sector brings. It sounds like you've got a specific query about a bit of Treasury methodology in terms of an investment case going forward, which I'm more than happy to look at. But, it has been many different parts of higher education driving real success in the cities across the UK. So, I think the case is there, and I'm happy to take that away and look at it.
Everybody wants you, Johnny. One more.
You can't miss the leader's speech.
In the middle.
Hi, Graham Tronsgill, Chief Executive of the British Insurance Brokers Association, BIBA. We've got about 1,800 firms trading about £105 billion, and 60% of them are small firms. And they say the biggest issue in their challenge for growth is the drag of regulation and how it's so hard for small business. It's the FCA I'm particularly talking about. But we're really heartened to see you've got the new Regulatory Innovation Office announced. And I wondered, what's your ambition with that? What could that look like? How could that help us?
Well, I agree. I think there's two specific government initiatives to tell you about in relation to that. I mean, the Office of Regulatory Innovation is about how to provide a sort of concierge hand-holding service to new investments, new opportunities that will basically help people regulate what at times is quite a confused or overlapping regulatory landscape in the UK. I think the second thing is probably, though maybe even more interest to your members, which is obviously DBT owns the smarter regulation framework. So obviously each government department has its own regulators, but the kind of aggregate impact on business is what DBT considers. And so we're doing a lot of work around that in terms of, how do regulators work? How can we give people more clarity, stability in terms of timescales for decisions to be made or how that will be done. I recognise this is something that a lot of businesses raise across the board about doing business in the UK. I'm also really keen to stress what businesses tell me, which is they don't want deregulation. They want to be a high regulation, high standard regulation jurisdiction. But there are issues. I mean, someone gave me an example the other day. They needed a decision from both I'm saying lots of nice things about France, but it was a European regulator and what we needed from something from the FCA, and the timescales between ourselves and the other country were not favourable to us. And I think if you're not interested or not checking those kind of benchmarks, something is amiss. And I think there is a set of reasonable complaints from business about how some of those things are working at the minute, and that's a piece of work from my department.
I think it's obvious from the spectrum of questions how many demands are on you at the moment. It's only been about 80 days, but we really are all looking forward to more detail over the coming events. I know we've got the Investment Summit, we've got the budget, but I think it's really obvious that there is a lot of hope being placed on your government. We look forward to more positivity. Everyone, thank you to the Business Secretary.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, mate. Really appreciate that. Thank you.
That was Lizzy Burden speaking to the Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds at the Labour Party conference. We'll be back with more next week from the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.